Oh, wonderful. I'm so excited for your presentation. I've been boosting this. I've been telling people like, you need to come for Marnese's presentation because I've seen your presentation. It's awesome. And this is going to be a lot of fun. But I've actually been really delighted personally just seeing so much focus on equity in our presentations today.
Mhm.
Wasn't an accident, but people really, they brought it today. So let me
They
read.
did. I just love that last presentation. I was like, okay, look at Berkeley.
Look at Berkeley. Yeah. So Marnese, everyone, this is Marnese Jackson. She is the co-director of the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition, and today her presentation is Revolutionizing Building Decarbonization in the Midwest. Marnese Jackson is an environmental and climate justice activist, an advocate, trainer, and educator from Pontiac, Michigan, where she is a mother of 2 children, London and Dawson. She is the co-educator of the co-director of the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition, where they inspire and educate Midwesterners to end new installations of fossil fuel equipment in residential and commercial buildings by 2030, and to achieve zero emissions from these buildings by 2050, with intentional, consistent integration of equity and labor justice across all facets of our work. She is also an appointed member of the State of Michigan Council on Climate Solutions. Welcome, Marnese.
Thank you, Sean. And quick question for housekeeping. What do you see? Do you just see my presenting slide? Do you see my notes?
I don't see your notes, just your slides.
All right, great. Well,
take it away. Thank you.
Okay, so everyone, yes, when we talk about revolutionizing, we're going to really embody that word. So I want everybody to put in the chat, think of someone who's a revolutionary. I'm going to think of Dr. Martin Luther King. Some people don't think he was a revolutionary, but he talked about everything that we're fighting for, like environmental justice, worker justice, labor justice, economic justice. So in the chat, if you want to put someone who you think is a revolutionary, because I want you all to think about the mindset of where we're going so we can decarbonize this sector in an equitable way. So as we all know, building decarbonization is urgent, and we must reduce the health, safety, and economic impacts of climate change and air pollution. Equally important is how we get there. We must collaborate equitably to center environmental justice communities who have been ignored, polluted, and pushed into unaffordable housing and debt. We must grow relationships and capacity to embody the principles of environmental justice while transforming policies, markets, and buildings in the United States. And since I'm in the Midwest, we're going to say Midwest as well, but everywhere. So in the Midwest, at the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition, we are an 8-state region. We are here to develop and implement equitable strategies to achieve zero emissions from the Midwestern building sector by 2050. And we do that by making sure that we center equity and labor justice across all facets of our work, whether it's QAP, whether it's market transformation, whether it's building codes. We are centering equity, but also getting people at the table. And so we deploy 40% of our funding efforts to have communities who do not have the budget, who are left out of these spaces, to be at our coalition, because we have to advance local grassroots EJ, CJ communities first, because they're impacted by these issues the worst and the most, right? So revolutionary change, I like to think Che Guevara, right, as one of the revolutionaries who I look up to. Some of us may not be ready for that conversation, but that's okay. I'll meet you where you are, because I love that you all put that in the chat. Elon Musk, King, LeBron James, yes, okay, RBG. I love that you all have a variety of what you think revolutionary is, right? And when you're doing this work, when I think about revolutionary, when we came up with the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition, there was no comprehensive plan to do or eliminate emissions on a regional strategic building level in 2019 when we came up with this model, like our coastal states, right? And so we have a challenge in here in the Midwest, because we have purple state politics, and to be quite honest, Michigan is one of those states where I'm at. And the only state that is very revolutionary, I could say, is Illinois. And so we look to Illinois within that CEJA bill to model how we're going to do this work, right? And then also we have these cold climates. So that means we're going to have high utility rates, right? Because most utility companies in the Midwest are not pro clean energy. They are with those fossil solutions of gas, right? And so we do this by intentionally focusing on developing our members. And so if you have a membership-based organization, or if you are advocating for low income or environmental and climate justice communities, you have to bring them along within the process, right? So that's revolutionary because, you know, they have been left out traditionally, right? And so with equity, what is equity? I would like to know, what is your definition of equity? You can just put some words in the chat, because we all are coming from different spaces of what we think equity is, right? But I'm going to give you the definition of environmental equity. It's the basic human right. Environmental justice is the act of protecting that right. Environmental justice involves the actions and activism necessary to highlight inequities and level the playing field, right? And you can see that on the screen where you see the little boy on the two boxes they're leveling, right? And this means proper oversight and review of federal policies, right? Hold our federal friends accountable. Proper permitting and licensing for companies, buildings, and warehouses that emit pollutions, setting clear standards, regulations, laws that protect at-risk communities, and awarding grants to organizations, not loans, grants, that act on behalf of these communities, right? And so according to the EPA, environmental equity can be broken down into two categories: fair treatment and meaningful involvement. Fair treatment means that no single sect of the population should be disproportionately affected by environmental crisis as a result of laws and policies. Meaningful involvement means that groups can offer input regardless and regarding decisions that affect their health of their environment. So you see where I'm going? We are saying that the people who are impacted by these issues need to be at the table so you can find these solutions, right? And thank you all for putting this in the chat. Progressive taxation paired with restorative fair reparations. See, there's the R word, love it. Which many of us are afraid of. So when we're thinking about revolutionary, you guys think about repair, reparations, okay? And not thinking about, if you are from a Caucasian community, that your ancestors did this to, you know, Black people. But, you know, quite honestly, equitable building decarbonization is about repairing what the past transgressions have done, because Black Americans, African Americans have built this country, right? And so with these foundations, we can't use the same practices that happened in the past to move what we're doing forward. And so with building decarbonization, we know it means converting appliances like stove, water heaters, furnaces, water heaters, from fossil fuels to clean, carbon-free, and electricity. But with equitable building decarbonization is an effort to incorporate racial equity and energy democracy into the process and the policies being proposed. And so the goal is to electrify the buildings. Is the same, but the key distinction is the process, the people, and the methods to achieve these goals, right? So you have to do them at the same time. You have to include the people in the process who are being impacted by these issues, right? So it has to be community engaged. So you have to get out your grassroots organizing hats, right? And bring people along. And the solutions, of course, is to clean our air, create healthier homes, create good jobs, right? And prevent community displacements. So, let me keep going now. So, you know, looking at this slide, you know, when I think about building decarbonization, I think about Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color nationwide who experience disproportionately poor air quality. And we know that. This is especially true in states like Michigan, where I live, where non-white communities face some of the most disproportionate particulate matter burden, meaning communities of color are more likely to be exposed to hazardous pollution created by fossil fuel companies and combustion. And so building contribute to this dangerous air pollution. And gas appliances like stoves, furnaces, and water heater release carbon monoxide compounds and all these different pollutants. And so when we're thinking about revolutionary, we have to think about the whole intersections of these issues. First is the racial issue, right? We have the racial issues, the economic injustice issues. People may not be able to switch to electrical appliances if they have a gas stove because that's the cost, right? And say if you're a renter like myself, I am a renter and I have a gas stove. So if my landlord do not want to get that cost, right, because I'm not ready to buy a home yet, think about the compromising situation that I come into all the time, because I do have 2 kids, London and Dawson, with asthma. So when we're doing our advocacy work, we have to think about this in a revolutionary intersectional viewpoint, and think about the cost that it has, because everybody is not an advocate like myself. Like, I'm an advocate and I advocate all the time, like, hey, you want to switch to electric because I have asthma? Oh, well, you can go rent somewhere else. Well, yeah, I could, but I can't afford it right now. Or why should I have to move, right? I know you're making money off of where I'm living, so why not switch it? Then you end up benefiting at the end. So bringing housing advocates to the table is very key when we're doing this work, and getting those real life stories like I told you about myself. So how can we quickly and equitably decarbonize our buildings? So when we do that, we have to also think about the landscape of the United States. And first, remember that this nation was founded through the displacement of indigenous people from their land and the enslavement of Africans and African Americans, whose labor contribute to building the infrastructure, right? So when we're thinking about the perspective of building electrification, we have to think about liberating these communities, because when we think about these communities being liberated, we also have to think about the cost. At the end of the day, it's about the money. And so when we're electrifying buildings, our neighborhoods, these homes, we have to also look at gentrification, where communities can be displaced because they may not be able to afford the cost of switching to these electrical appliances, right? Because we know once you get something new, the price is going to go up, your rent is going to go up. So advancing building electrification policies addresses both the climate and the immediate health, and also the immediate public health on vulnerable communities. So the implementation of building decarbonization policies, we know, does not center equity and the climate crisis at the same time. So that's why I asked, what did you think equity meant? We as advocates don't think of equity as something separate. This is only one way to do it. You have to incorporate equity within this process. So it's just not, it's a both, okay? So let's see. Okay. So with building decarbonization, while we're thinking about equity, we have to make sure we're advocating for those good jobs, like the installation, and making sure that the people who are doing this work, the contractors, we are deploying the funding to Black, Brown, Indigenous, and low-income contractors, right? So they can move up the economic ladder to do this work. And then also pay them fair wages. We can't fight for $15. That's not enough to live in the United States. We have to move up the ladder because it's, it costs, right? Everything is going up, inflation, COVID, right? Then we also have to make sure that people are not displaced, right? This is really key when we're thinking about advancing building electrification in our field. So to do that, we have to make sure that we address the energy burden, avoid displacement, and create the good jobs that we all want. And I love when she was talking about the previous presenter about just transition. So I just want to give you guys a stat though. There is a national shortage of affordable rental housing in the United States. And so within the Midwestern states, having between 31 to 45 available affordable rental homes per 100 extremely low income renter households, this is a problem because renters are going to be faced with high rent and then of course nowhere to live because there's not a lot of affordable housing. So advancing building decarbonization is also thinking about multi-family units, right? Because most of the time in multi-family units, the landlords or the renting company is not going to decarbonize the buildings. And then we have to make sure that we change the narrative when we're thinking about doing this work. So with our climate goals, as I talked about revolutionizing the building sector and who's displaced, so we have to think about our own self and how we can contribute to perpetuating these false narratives that's not working. So yes, carbon neutrality is a goal, right? And it does means that building generates as much energy as it consumes over a period of time. But over shorter time periods, such as day, the building could, of course, be generating less energy than it uses and draw energy from the grid. But on other days, it might generate more energy than it needs and sell excess back to the grid. And so when we think about revolutionizing the building sector, we have to think about net metering policies because, of course, we want people to make money off of all the energy they're generating. And so when we think about net zero, building owners were to claim that they were net zero because they bought carbon offsets to compensate for the energy usage that they use. That's where it began to be false and problematic definition of net zero, because net zero by some future date, by investing in some development of some type of air capture technology to pull carbon dioxide out of the air, that doesn't mean it's going to work because we don't know if these proven technologies is going to work, right? I haven't heard anything, and I'm in Michigan. They are trying to push that narrative, but it hasn't been proven to work. And so we have to go climate positive, which means that activity goes beyond achieving net zero carbon emissions to create an environmental benefit by removing additional carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And carbon negative means that the same thing as climate positive. So I think the terminology, we kind of have to level set where we're going to go with, because net zero carbon emissions means that an activity releases net zero carbon emissions into the atmosphere. Net zero emissions balance the whole amount of greenhouse gases out. And so we need to be going carbon negative, not level setting it out. And yes, that's a goal for like 2030, 2050, which is, obtainable. However, we need to just be going carbon zero. And I'm coming from a standpoint of the climate justice impact, because we have these technologies that we're investing in where we can be investing in the communities, right, with these solutions. Yeah. To the chat real quick, make sure I'm not missing anything. So with equity issues related to emerging building electrification policy agenda, there are so many unanswered questions, right? And so at the city and regional planning process, we have to engage the community-based organizations. And so you have to do your groundwork, right? You have to go back to those revolutionary ideas like Che Guevara, Dr. Martin Luther King, the Black Panthers did. I mean, however we may feel about their ideologies and how they advance things, they started at the community level and got people engaged, right? And so you have to put people and those voices in these leadership roles. And don't speak for the communities because you really don't know them. You have to bring them along and of course educate them if they don't know anything about this sector. So while you have to assess the community needs, you have to establish a community-led decision-making process. So you have to move out the way. You have to develop matrix and plans. And of course, we all need to plan and do that because we want to goal set. We have those ambitious goals by 2030, 2050, but we have to goal set and be realistic. And I understand there's a lot of money coming down from the federal government. Still got to do your work, right? And then you have to leverage that funding and redistribute the money to these communities. Okay, we have a lot of big greens who are at the table who get the money first, but not doing the real work. Okay, and so revolutionizing the building sector means that you're going to have to transform your thought process, okay? And so when I say white supremacy culture, this is not to attack white people. We're attacking the ideology of the culture that we're in, right? And it's very precise and present in our future, right? And how we think and how we do things, which is hurting communities of color, even and honestly hurting other white folks, okay, from doing the real work and doing it in the right way. So this lesson, I'm gonna put the how you get to white supremacy culture, and there's a whole bunch of characteristics. The one that comes up a lot when we're doing this work, because we have to act on climate, right? The IPCC report says so. We see these weather patterns changing. We see bills going up because of our utility providers who don't want to switch to clean air, clean energy, you know, solar, wind, geothermal, those three. Anything bio is not, it's a false solution, right? The thing is, when you try to move so fast, you don't do it in the right way. And I'm being quite honest, communities of color, we don't operate in the urgency that you operate in because we have other pressing urgencies, like, for example, making sure that our kid don't catch COVID like everybody else, or making sure that so we can walk down the street and not get shot by police officers. Those are just some examples, okay? Just be keeping it real with you guys, talking about revolutionizing the building sector. We have to come at this at an intersectional type of way. So when I think about white supremacy culture, the main thing I hear when I do these presentations, when I be in working groups, is the sense of urgency. We got to do this and we got to do it right now, but we're not doing it right, okay? So you have to be realistic, right? When you're setting your goals. And honestly, you have to have those real conversations about the decision making. Just because communities of color don't show up when they want to doesn't mean they won't show up. Okay, but you have to build trust, and building trust, you can't do that when you come into a community, whether it's an NAACP meeting or urban league meeting, and assume they're going to move because you want them to move, right? So you have to be realistic and build those just relationships in like the HIMAS principles. And then you have to be realistic about these funding proposals. Redistribute the money to the communities that are doing the work, the real work, if you really want to act on climate. And so I love this slide. I got this from the Climate Justice Alliance, that we have to also transition our thinking of how we redistribute the money. We live in an extractive economy under capitalism. That's where we're at. We get it. We have to go back to work. We cannot be out here in this pandemic. We got to hurry up and go back to work, right? Capitalism. So we have to move from exploiting our workers, ourselves, to moving towards being caring in a regenerative economy. That's the only way we're going to solve this climate crisis, because the climate crisis is built on capitalism and it's colonialism. So within these racism and patriarchal systems, we're not going to solve anything. So you can't use the same system to solve these issues. So I ask everyone to dig deeper if you really want to do building decarbonization work. Because transition is inevitable, and justice is not. And so being revolutionary means that you have to be regenerative. You have to redistribute the resources to communities that need the most, who are doing the work, right? In the right way, who has the solutions, okay? In a cooperative way, we're working together, mutual respect. Let's see, go, because I think I'm almost at time. And so I love this slide because it kind of, and you'll get these slides, of course, it diagrams everything we need to do to look at communities of colors and low income communities. As I stated before, they bear the brunt of impacts of unhealthy, energy inefficient, vulnerable buildings, right? And when we look at this slide, we have to think about the sustainable and regenerative building sector. There is little representation of communities of color in this sector, okay? If you look around the room in the spaces that you're at, who's at the table, right? So when we're switching to make this revolutionary, you have to bring everybody at the table, wherever it's activists, contractors, project managers, architects, engineers, the unrepresented, to design this what we want to look like, to design healthy buildings. And I see Sean is back. And so this slide, if you are not incorporating this into your framework of doing the work, you have some work to do, okay? So, like I said, Sean is going to give you these slides, but make sure that you move towards involving and collaborating and defending these different communities, okay? And defer to these communities when you're doing the work. And so I also refer to Greenlining Institute for reference, and then also the NAACP Center on Equity in the Building Sustainability Sector as a reference when doing this work. So that is all, and thank you, Sean. Let's see. I'm not sure.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Marnese. So one of the things I want to ask, so gentrification, right? This is an important theme of as we invest money into improving buildings, how do we not displace people? And what policies are bubbling up from, say, Illinois? Or like one example we have in California is SOMA, where the solar arrays get given to the apartment complexes and they're not allowed to raise the rents. Essentially, it's just explicitly prohibited. You can't raise rents when the solar array gets given to this low-income housing development. What do you have as an offering, an idea, a solution?
To prevent gentrification. Okay, so, and I can only speak for my city because some people feel that gentrification is okay, depends on how you look at it. I think prevention is, of course, having community involved, right? Back to community organizing, but preventing is also knowing your elected officials, who you're voting for. And I know cities have to get built up. I live in a city that's low income to moderate income. It's kind of like a microcosm of Detroit. But it's like one of those cities that's coming back. We call that, for example, the new Detroit, where, you know, it's the white flight. And when I say white people, that's not intact. Okay, you guys, don't. When I say that the white flight, that means that the Black people are, and the brown people, the original residents, are getting moved out, gentrification, right? And these people, not to say new people, now I can't even say it's all white people, because I have seen a lot of different types of people come to Detroit that are not even from Detroit, and I think they call them transplants. So I would say, to prevent justification, you have to call it out and just explicitly say what it is. It's like the cousin of colonization, okay? Or racism. You have to say, okay, and that's, I don't have the best answer for it, but you have to go back to the basic community organizing practices. You have to get in front of your city council face, because the local government are the ones who are going to push gentrification in the communities, right?
Well, here's a thought. So I was recently approached by a multifamily rental owner who, as we chatted, I realized that he was explicitly proposing that that's what he does, is he gentrifies apartment complexes from 1960s and 70s. And he's like, hey, can you help me out with this? I'd like to electrify and solarize these buildings as a part of just the normal job we do of buying it, flipping it, renting it to new people. So I had to do a real gut check on how I felt about that. And
well, and I know, and I also think about the intent when you're talking to these people, when they want to come into the community, you got to think about their intent. Of course, I'm looking at the fact that they're benefiting from it. And you have to ask those questions. Is this a cooperative, mutual thing? What am I getting out of this as well? And my rent, is my rent going to go up because you did this to this building? Then that's the problem. And that's when you start to organize the residents. Hey, there's a such thing as a rent strike. You can't do that. There's rent associations that you can advocate for yourself. And I think a lot of times they're going to try to keep the residents to stay. It's kind of like the Boy Scout, the bus boys boycott. Gosh, in the 60s. Okay, fine. you don't want to, you're going to hike up the rent because you want the building to look great. That's great. Okay. Well, you can't, okay, then the residents have to have so much power that they will move and there's a mass exodus out of that building. Okay. They're going to find somewhere else to live, which means the tenant or the renter, the landlord, he's going to end up losing in the first place anyway. So it's kind of like going back to those practices of organizing, building power, movement building. Everything goes back to what Dr. King and everybody else before us in these social movements did. So yes, so I will also say that when you elect these officials, they're when you elect these city council officials, these mayors, they're going to sometimes flip on you. Okay. That means that you know that in the next 4 years, you got to get them out of there, even though the harm is going to be has happened. But once again, it goes back to building people power and moving power. They can't just think about what they did in the 60s. That had a huge impact. Not to say that they didn't have pitfalls on type of stuff, but you have to get strong enough to do things like that.
I've done a lot of marches in my life. They're pretty effective, actually.
Well, I'm not just talking about marching, because I don't think that I personally, I'm beyond marching. Okay. Oh. You have to hit them in the pocket. The money, where the money is, where the money resides. You can't just march. You have to show up for, you have to use the tactics of showing up to the city council, but then you also have to use, if everybody decide not to pay their rent, of course you got to have a backup plan, right? Pay, of course you got, don't call me on that. Don't just not pay your rent. But if you just, everybody decide not to pay their rent and go on a strike, and everybody, for example, if you're in a low income building and you have to go down to assistance because you can't afford your rent, there's going to be a problem, because they're going to be like, why everybody at the same location can't pay their rent? And that's when everybody else is getting involved. So it's also about the strategy too.
Thinking like rent strikes, like collective negotiating with landlords. You know, like my sister, the gas system in the boiler downstairs, it was over in New York City. It had a fire. They had to shut the whole thing down. Can't use gas stoves. And then they're trying to negotiate reduced rent. And the conversation, like, do they electrify or not? And they should. And who should end up paying for this? Is this going to essentially gentrify or increase the rents? They're all in rent-controlled housing. And this, it's a tough nut, but it seems like anti-displacement policies in affordable housing right now, if you like a regulated affordable housing, if you do a retrofit and electrify, you have to have a place for these people to live while you're electrifying and doing other retrofits to their apartment. And then they have to be able to move back in. That's the policy in regulated affordable housing. It seems like something like that could be extended to all housing in a very fair way, just to say, like, they get to move back in. You need to arrange for this so that they're not homeless. Like, we'll help you do the retrofit, but you can't make them homeless, and they get to come back home, and you know the rent increases 5% or 10% or something, like some regulated amount, because of the, like, my next presentation is on split incentives. Okay. And like how to address the split incentive with rental housing, because it's a pretty big deal how to finance it. So speaking of, I got to drink some water.
No, this is awesome. And I now I'm thinking about everything you said, is because I know that's going to happen in my city. And there's another thing within the building decarbonization where we're probably going to have to get to quickly to strategize on things like this, the housing QAP sector. Make sure.
Well,
I'm thinking
we're all here now. Thank you so much, Marnese.
Yes, thank you too. A nice seeing everybody.
And could you put your email address into the chat so people can correspond with you? We can build an alliance, and you know, we really do need a national strategy that is equitable and takes care of people as we do this rapid electrification work. We need that. Like Kate, just before, you can see like they're brewing it over in Berkeley. They're seeing what they can do.